Okay, so we're diving right in today. You guys have been sending in some seriously thought-provoking questions, like what happens when even the Pope, the head honcho of the Catholic Church, seems to, deviate from the Church's teachings?
It's a big one, right? Kind of shakes things up when the authority you trust seems to be going in a different direction than you'd expect.
Exactly, and the sources you sent us really get into the nitty-gritty of this, especially that line from the Gospels about casting the first stone.
Oh, yeah. That's a powerful one. Let he who is without sin.
Right. So we're really going to unpack that today because it gets to the heart of how we can even think about challenging authority, especially within a faith tradition that places so much emphasis on the papacy.
Absolutely. I mean, at first glance, that whole casting stones idea might seem like it's saying don't question authority, just go with the flow.
Like, who are we to judge?
Exactly. But the sources we're looking at today really dig into the nuances of what Jesus was actually saying in that story about the woman accused of adultery.
Right, because he didn't just let her off the hook, did he?
Not at all. He challenged the hypocrisy of the crowd, sure, but he also told the woman to go and sin no more.
So it was about more than just don't judge. It was about acknowledging our own flaws while still upholding what's right.
Exactly. And that's where it gets really interesting when we're talking about the Pope and potential errors in, teachings or interpretations.
Because doesn't Catholicism have that whole papal infallibility thing? So how does that work if a pope can, make mistakes?
Right. And that's one of the biggest misunderstandings out there. The sources are very clear. Papal infallibility is not some kind of superpower that makes everything a pope says inherently correct.
Like a get-out-of-jail-free card.
Exactly. Yep. It only applies under extremely specific conditions. The Pope has to be speaking ex cathedra, which basically means from the chair of Peter, as the successor of Peter.
So in his official capacity.
Exactly. And it has to be on a matter of faith or morals, and even then, it's only been invoked a handful of times throughout history.
Wow, so outside of those really specific moments, a pope eyes open to getting things wrong.
That's right. And, there have been instances in church history where a pope's actions or teachings have been, let's just say, debated.
That's actually questioned? Has that ever happened?
It has. One example from the sources that comes to mind is Pope Honorius I back in the 7th century. He got caught up in this theological debate about the will of Christ.
Okay, so really complex theological stuff.
Right. And long story short, he ended up supporting a view that the church later deemed heretical.
Wow. So what happened? Everyone just went, well, he's the Pope, so I guess that's okay now.
Not quite. A few decades later, a church council actually condemned his writings, and he was posthumously declared anathema.
Anathema, like officially denounced.
Yep. Essentially, it means he was considered outside the bounds of the church's teachings.
Wow. That's intense. But it kind of goes back to that whole casting stones thing, doesn't it? Because someone, somewhere, had to speak up and say, hey, this isn't right.
It really does. And that's a key takeaway from these sources. It's not about being disrespectful to the papacy. It's about loving the church enough to point out where things might have gone wrong so that the faith itself can remain strong.
So how do we reconcile those two things? Because it still feels kind of tricky. On the one hand, we've got this call to not judge. And on the other, we're talking about the need to, judge whether teachings are right or wrong.
I hear you. The sources make a really important distinction here. It's not about attacking someone's character or trying to tear them down. It's about engaging in honest, respectful dialogue about the teachings themselves.
So it's like, you can disagree with the teacher, but you still respect the role of a teacher.
Exactly. Or think about it like this. Imagine a surgeon. They might be a wonderful person, but if they're using outdated medical practices that could harm their patients, you'd want someone to say something.
Right, because ultimately it's about protecting the patient, which in this case is the faith itself.
You've got it. And the sources even point out that throughout church history, there are examples of theologians, even saints, who respectfully challenged papal decisions because they saw those decisions as straying from the core of the faith. It's about that willingness to engage in dialogue, even when it's tough.
So just to be super clear for everyone, let's say, hypothetically, a modern-day pope starts teaching something that a lot of people believe is heresy. What happens then? Do we just have to wait centuries for a future council to weigh in?
That's a great question. Luckily, the church has systems in place for these kinds of situations, and they're laid out in something called canon law.
Canon law. So that's like the internal rule book of the church.
Basically. It's obviously very complex, but it outlines procedures for how these things are supposed to be handled. In a nutshell, it involves bishops, who are the successors of the apostles, having a responsibility to both uphold the faith and to address any teachings that might deviate from it.
Okay, so there are actually steps in place. It's not just, well, hope for the best.
Exactly.
It's pretty fascinating when you think about it, this whole balancing act of respecting authority while also making sure the faith stays true to its core.
It is. And, this dynamic, this tension between individual leadership and established doctrine, it's something you see in all kinds of institutions throughout history. It's not unique to the church at all. Think about governments, organizations, even social movements.
Right. Where do you draw that line? When is it right to speak up, and how do you do it in a way that's both respectful and effective?
Exactly. It's a question that's been around for centuries, and it's one that we'll probably continue grappling with for centuries to come. What other examples come to mind for you?
Well, that's a great question. I'm going to have to give that some more thought.